guys, this is Matt Wenning at winningstrength.com, and today I want to talk about a special topic, and it's about all-time great strength coaches. Now, there are far more than the ones that we're going to dive into on this video, but I feel these guys need extreme recognition, and some of these names have been completely forgotten. If it wouldn't have been for Louis Simmons, Charles Poliquin, Dave Tate, and a handful of others, I may have never even known who these people were. But fast forward into 20, 30 years later, I think it's time to share some of these guys' names, maybe let you look them up for yourself, dive into some of their books, and maybe it'll give you a better understanding of how to train and where we're at in strength conditioning today. So please subscribe, like, and leave comments below on who influenced you in your training and what methods you're using and why. Now, as many of you know or may not know, I got my undergraduate in exercise science and my master's in biomechanics from Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. Now, interestingly enough, I grew up in Muncie, Indiana, and had no idea that it was one of the top schools in the country at that time in exercise science. I actually had to go and do a job shadow/internship at the Indianapolis Colts as a teenager to find out that I was in the mecca of strength conditioning in my hometown, which is totally crazy. So I'm going to go in the order in which I found these people out, so that way you can kind of see a history of not only these people, but also how I got introduced to them along the way. Now, Ball State University was an amazing school. At the time I was there, we were doing research with NASA. We had a lot of the best professors and some of the leading researchers, as well as some of the founding fathers of the NSCA, namely Dr. Kramer and Dr. Volek. With that being said, I was introduced to this first person much sooner than the rest, and his name was Boyd Epley. Now, Boyd Epley, if you don't know, was the head strength coach from 1969 all the way up, I want to say, into the 90s or the 2000s at University of Nebraska. What made his story interesting is that prior to 1969 and Boyd Epley, University of Nebraska didn't use weight training for football, which wasn't uncommon up until like around the mid-late 80s. So as far as a profession goes, strength conditioning is fairly new, only being around 30, 35 years old in most schools. But University of Nebraska was one of the first schools to organize an actual strength conditioning program for their football team at first, and then probably the other schools as well, or the other sports as well. Boyd Epley came in, and from what I remember, the storytelling to me was he was a graduate assistant. He had been studying some other stuff overseas, and he had seen that weight training was helping sprinting and jumping capacities from some of these other authors earlier. Comes up to the head coach who had just lost to Oklahoma and had a mediocre record of around, I want to say, 6-4, which we'll get to in a minute. He comes up to the University of Nebraska's head coach and goes, I believe if we start a strength conditioning program that we might be able to beat Oklahoma and become a winning season team. And from what I heard, the head football coach in Nebraska goes, awesome, I would be glad to take this on, but if it doesn't work, you're fired. So talk about some stress, right? Well, Boyd Epley knew that it was going to work and knew that other schools were not using strength training at the time to play football. So he organizes a strength conditioning program, which I'm sure was fairly elementary in the beginning. But what you start to realize is that they end up beating Oklahoma and becoming back-to-back national champions in 1970 and 71. This starts the craze of strength training for sports over the entire country. GAs and assistants of Boyd Epley were getting hired by other schools to bring in this secret way of training for different sports, in which Boyd Epley was actually the beginning person of this era. And so what I think we have to understand is that Boyd Epley, if it weren't for him, it might have taken many more years for the Western sports culture to wake up and start utilizing weight training for sports. But because Nebraska was so dominant in the 70s, it created a boom in strength conditioning for college athletes and then filtering down to high school athletes and even filtering up to pro athletes. So I find that Boyd Epley may not get now the credit that he deserves because it's been so long ago that he had done this in 1969. So what are the big things that I think Boyd Epley needs to have credit for? Well, I think you have to look at, he had 5 national titles as a strength coach, which is huge, 35 bowl game appearances, and 356 wins as a football team. That's pretty impressive for any career, let alone who we consider in the West the godfather of strength conditioning. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was he was the first known coach to have a structured testing of vertical jump, 10-yard dash, agility runs, and using them and adjusting them for size and gender. So this is pretty impressive considering that most coaches were not doing this at the time. The next big thing I think we have to give him credit for is the formation of the NSCA, or the National Strength Conditioning Association. So the reason I heard of Boyd Epley first was because he was the founder of the NSCA, and so were some of my other professors. So Boyd Epley was treated like a higher level tier person, even in my college, just based on the fact that my professors were all integrated with Boyd Epley at the time of the NSCA. And so I find that without the NSCA, I think that we would be even further behind, even though I feel that some of the ways that they want to train or have people study for the CSCS wouldn't be my personal way to do things. I think that it's a good gold standard. So the CSCS test for the NSCA is still what I consider the gold standard in our profession, and it's mostly needed for almost all high school, college, or pro team sports. The next big thing that I think we have to give Boyd Epley credit for is dispelling the myth that weight training isn't for sports. You know, pre-Boyd Epley and pre those national titles at Nebraska, most people looked at weight training as just for bodybuilding. They didn't look at it as to make me run faster or jump higher or play football better or whatever other of those cases may be. Boyd Epley broke that mold and told people you need to get stronger in order to play better. And I think we can all tip our hats for him now in this field. Now, as an undergrad at Ball State in 1999, I'm curious and I have a lot of questions for Dr. Kramer, which was one of my first real serious exercise science courses. And I'm asking him about this and that, and I'm big into powerlifting. I had already won my first world title as a teenager, and I wanted to know how to be the strongest I could be. And I remember having a book turned over to me by Kramer that was Tudor Bompa's book. And Tudor Bompa's book was this one. This is actually the copy here. You can see how tattered and old it is. This book, when I got it, opened my eyes to all kinds of different ways of training that I never even thought of. Some of things included, and I'll get into these little clips, was the force velocity curve. That was a big thing that I had never seen, right? To understand how to get faster, to get stronger. Phases of strength is another spot in this. Using depth jumps, which leads me to another author that we're about to talk about here in a little bit. The nervous system. You know, we all think that strength is about muscle, but in reality, we have to realize that the central nervous system plays probably even a larger role than the muscle mass as far as strength is concerned. Transferring strength into power. There's some other things like transition phases, hypertrophy before strength, super maximum loads, number of exercises per workout. These were some things that, in my mind, were just mind-boggling, and things that we still see other authors and other strength coaches and other manual makers make huge mistakes on because they're just not reading. But Tudor Bompa was the next person that really got on my list. Now, Tudor Bompa was originally from Romania and moved to Canada, which made his books and his information a little bit more readily available than the Soviet methods that we'll get to here in a minute. But Tudor Bompa was a PhD and started his personal training with 11 Olympic medalists, which included 4 gold medals in Romania. He was a great athlete himself, winning several silver and bronze medals as a junior, and then a European medalist as a rower. So this guy was not only a very studied person, he was also a very good athlete. His education started in Romania, was the Institute of Physical Culture and Sports at Bucharest. 1970, he moves to Canada, finishes his doctoral degree at State University in New York in 79. And I think what you start have to realizing is that Tudor Bompa, and I'm going to go over a couple of things that I think he needs credit for. He was one of the first people to bring over an Eastern European mindset to Western coaches, which was a huge, huge thing if you were keeping up with who this guy was and what he was doing in the 80s and the 90s. So I think we have to give him credit for bringing a little bit of this Eastern Bloc information over to the United States somewhere around 1980. He's an author of 19 books, and they've been translated into 22 languages, making him a global authority. It's sold over 1 million copies, which is insane for in total for all of these books for an exercise science type person and performance person. And we have to think about how many people have called him the father of periodization from his teachings, because he started talking about periodization in his Romanian works in 1963. Now, there's a big debate on who started periodization. I would probably go more towards some authors I'm getting ready to talk to here in a minute. But Tudor Bompa had a massive impact on Western strength conditioning. And I think that we need to do more of his reading, and we need to get those original books to kind of get an understanding of like where my mindset comes with manuals, off-season training, how I do stuff for special forces or football training. A lot of that stuff has a lot of influence from Tudor Bompa and should have a lot of influence in your training as well. Now, in my personal journey, as we fast forward about a year later, I run into a guy named Louis Simmons. Louis Simmons was the head coach and founder of Westside Barbell in Columbus, Ohio, which was about a 3-hour drive from where I was going to school and where I grew up at. And so as I meet Louis Simmons around 99, 2000, he starts talking about all these Russian texts. And I see, not only at his house, but sometimes at the gym, books by Yuri Verkhoshansky. And this started to kind of get my mind twisting into who was this Yuri Verkhoshansky and why was he so important? Because I had never heard of him. We had never studied him in school, both in undergrad or master's degree. And it was a damn shame, to be honest with you, because he was probably one of the initial inventors of strength conditioning as we know it. Probably a good solid 15 or 20 years before Boyd Epley. Now, Yuri Verkhoshansky was a Soviet scientist and also coach and also a decent track runner in the 40s, if I remember correctly. But he's known as the father of plyometrics, and his coaching and research has started around the 1950s. So you can see already there, he's already kind of ahead of Tudor Bompa, but not well known because, one, his books never got translated outside of the Soviet Union. I think what we have to remember is the reason the Russians were far ahead and we never knew it was because it was during a Cold War. So once the book comes out that you see on my book, you'll see some of these reasonings of why I think, and the studies that I done, that why Russia was so far ahead, but why we didn't know was because it was a race, and it was a Cold War race, and the way that the Soviets wanted to show dominance was to win more Olympic medals. And so they're not going to give out information in books to the West on how the Russians are winning, right? So I think that created a problem with Yuri Verkhoshansky not getting known as probably the father of a lot of this stuff, including before Tudor Bompa. He started as a track coach in Moscow and of the Institute of Aeronautic Engineers. He took non-athletes and made them high-level track and field jumpers, which got a lot of attention from the state of Russia. He was one of the first recorded coaches to use a barbell back squat in the developments of sports training. So not only was he intrigued with jumping and sprinting, he started utilizing weight training for these different sports in like the 1950s and early 60s. So think about that. Boyd Epley's kind of the father of strength and conditioning in America. He introduces weight training in around 1970, and you got Verkhoshansky doing this in the 50s, so almost 20 years earlier. It's one of those things where it kind of just blows your mind. He also created the shock method, which is like depth jumps, innovation and progression of athletes. He became the head coach of Moscow team for sprinting and jumping events. So now he's the head coach of all sprinting and jumping at the Olympic level in Moscow, giving him access to some of the top athletes in the world. So if you can take below average people and make them great, what are you going to be able to do with already great athletes? Probably a lot. What you have to remember with Verkhoshansky is He's an author of internationally now of 29 texts from 1961 to 18. But if you go and look on his Wikipedia, some of those are not in our language, so we never had access to them until somebody translated them. He's also inventive of the block system, which is a form of periodization, conjugate sequencing system, which is very similar to how Louis and I and a lot of other high-level coaches think about training, and a long delay training effect. So he was kind of one of the first guys to see that not everything is acute. So, you don't just work out and then the next day you're recovered and you're better. There's longer periodization models to understanding how the body takes loading over longer periods of time. So workouts are not just daily or maybe not even just weekly. They're actually a monthly transitional idea of how to get the body better. And Verkhoshansky was one of the first to kind of introduce that. So long-term planning, block periodization, conjugate sequence training, depth jumps, and using barbells for track and field sport athletes, I think creates a legacy that needs to be remained in time, that Verkhoshansky was one of the top guys in the world, just wasn't highly recognized in the West because we were hidden from his information for quite a while. So if you don't know Verkhoshansky, dig into his work. Now, if you want to see the last author that I'm going to talk about, which is insanely important for not only the development of Westside Barbells training, but my own and a lot of what I talk about, come on and join Patreon and we'll talk about the next author, because I'm going to dive in really deep on this person and I'm going to show you why it's so important that he created a system that went far and beyond what anybody had ever seen, both in the West and in the East, that created some of the top lifters to ever live, not only as an individual, but as in teams and dozens of great athletes. So I hope to see you guys on Patreon. I'll post this particular video on the lowest tier.
I'm on a strength training program from a world-class powerlifter, a world record-holding powerlifter, Matt Wenning, and I've tagged him on this. Matt came by a few weeks ago when he was going across the United States on his Harley Davidson, and he stopped by. And a couple of years ago, he had made a program for me, but it was so foreign to me, it didn't make sense. Man, he sat down, broke down the program for me, so now I understand it. And it's been a lot of fun training with so much structure and with so much focus on posterior chain. My glutes, my hamstrings, my low back is weaker than a fucking kitten. It's embarrassing. So we're focusing on that. It's a well-rounded program, which you don't just do the traditional lifts. You're training a lot of accessory stuff, tricep stuff to improve your lifts. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the program's going to do me. I'm in the third week. It's a 12-week process, so it's going to be fun.